All right, hello everyone. I am here with Devin Goure, left Nietzschean. I'm wearing my Star Trek shirt, and we are going to talk about Star Trek and philosophy. And that may seem a bit odd given that we both come from a Nietzschean background, and Nietzsche is not normally associated with Star Trek. But I think over the course of this conversation, we'll be able to bring forth some new ways of looking at the show that I hope will be interesting and edifying for those of you who are Trekkies or just interested in Star Trek and fans of philosophy. But before we get going, Devin, thank you very much for coming on the show. Could you introduce yourself to people who aren't familiar with your work and then tell us about getting into Star Trek?
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, Keegan, thank you so much for having me back. I was really excited when you suggested this topic as a late arrival to Star Trek fandom. I was happy to hear that you wanted to discuss it with me in the Nietzsche context. It has been on my mind a whole lot recently. For people who are not familiar with me or my work, I go by Left Nietzschean on Twitter and Substack. And I focus on kind of adapting Nietzsche's insights for issues related to left emancipatory politics, but also questions regarding madness, kind of the problem of psychiatry and its approach to mental health problems. And that's while I'm not somebody who construes Nietzsche as himself a leftist, my kind of overarching theme has been to seek out some themes that can be drawn from Nietzsche that are not associated specifically with right politics, but can have still be rich terrain for left wing politics. As far as the connection to Trek, as I mentioned, a late arrival, despite the fact that both of my parents were huge fans of the original series back in the day, I actually didn't start watching Star Trek until I guess now it would be summer 2024. So you can think about summer 2024 to like spring 2025 for me as this epic Star Trek binge period where I literally watched, I didn't watch animated series, I didn't watch Prodigy or short treks, um, everything else essentially, even the new Trek, for better or for worse, probably for worse.
Oh, wow.
Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but
Maybe we'll get into that. Maybe not. We'll see.
maybe not. Yeah, I don't know. We'll see. Um, but while I was watching, even though Nietzsche's always on my mind, I didn't really think about Trek in a specifically Nietzschean lens. But as we started to kind of go back and forth about thinking about this episode, I really had fun starting to riff on the ideas and draw kind of some creative and fun connections with Nietzsche that I think might help cast the show in a new light.
Yeah, it's also something that has been on my mind, and I don't know if I can really point to any genesis of my thinking about Nietzsche and Star Trek. I think where it really came out of for me is in perceiving how the show is often referred to as utopian. But that's sort of a loaded word in a lot of ways because oftentimes when we think about a utopia, we conceive of a stasis in which everything is solved, everyone's content, all of the problems are handled. And, then we can just sort of, as Dostoevsky says in Underground Man, we can just busy ourselves with the reproduction of the species, eat cakes, and it's all dandy. And, there are a number of sci-fi properties that take us in a dystopian direction. There are also a number that show sort of critique utopia or show a utopia that behind the veneer, there's something dark going on beneath it, or behind an apparent utopia. There's all sorts of examples of this. But I started to notice that Star Trek didn't really neatly fit into a category of like a purely utopian show in the sense of portraying that stasis, that contentment. It wasn't definitely not a dystopian show. And I think what clued it in for me was a number of things. For one, it's the fact that we don't spend much time on Earth in the Star Trek shows. We're out in the wilderness, sort of pushing beyond, exploring. It's as if the people in this society, their capital is no longer currency. It's sort of social prestige and accomplishment and self-transformation and all of these things. So that was sort of one element. But then another element I noticed was from the very beginning of the show with the cage, and they would later put this in the menagerie, there's this sort of, there's a plot line where the characters are attracted to a kind of retrogressive utopia, or it might even be in a strange way technologically achieved, but it puts people in a position where they no longer have to strive for anything. They no longer have to struggle for anything. And that's always presented in the show as like a dead end for humanity, that it would actually deprive us of something that we very much need. And this ties into another theme of the society run by the computer. Kirk, there's a famous sort of trope, Kirk discussing a computer to death, but that often happens in the context of a machine is running this whole society. And the most famous example probably is Return of the Archons, where Kirk basically logics the machine into understanding you've destroyed these people's potential. You've sort of like retrogressed them to a Victorian era, and you're managing everything, and there's no room for them to grow. You're not actually preserving them because this is a real need or something within humanity. And another sub theme within the show of the need, especially the original series, of sort of the enemy within, the need for passion and for irrationality, really, of not being purely rational beings. We're living beings. And so there are a number of episodes where the characters are presented with a utopia and actually reject it. And I found that to be very interesting because it shows, again, this sort of polysemy of the way we use the term utopian. That Star Trek isn't portraying a utopian society in which all the problems are solved. It's one in which we ourselves have become better, and we are continually willing to confront new and more complex and higher challenges. And so all of the problems that we have in the past are sort of a memory in Star Trek, but they're not just sort of sitting around on a hippie planet. And this side of paradise would be another great example. You have these spores that cure all diseases, extend your life, and the people are just sort of living there. They went to go out and settle a new world and build something new. Instead, they're just sort of sitting around on farms with a dumb smile on their face and hanging out in nature. And it's very Rousseauian and romantic in a way. And the show rejects this, and it rejects it through the narrative that Kirk has to summon a kind of irrational passion within himself. He has to summon anger and really kind of primitive human emotions to rebel against it. But when he does this, everyone sort of sees, the leader of the colony says, we've done nothing here. And Kirk says, he uses the analogy that they often use of being kicked out of Eden, but he says, this time we walked out, and perhaps it's our lot to march to the beat of drums. It's not, perhaps paradise wasn't made for us. And that, to me, I didn't initially think about that in a Nietzschean lens. But the more I thought about it, the more I was like, there is a Nietzschean point there. And so maybe I'll kick it over to you with sort of maybe where your mind goes with a lot of these themes.
Yeah, that's great. I guess I have a couple of thoughts that I want to, I guess, start with the Star Trek references and then kind of work my way a little bit to my kind of Nietzschean framing. I think the menagerie slash the cage is a great place to start. Of course, the cage being the aborted initial Star Trek pilot that we see later on and gets incorporated then into the menagerie, where the story is retold from the perspective of Kirk and Spock at a later time, returning to the planet where Christopher Pike had this encounter with this superior race that kind of offers him a life of pure pleasure and bliss in exchange for giving up his ambition, essentially. And at the beginning of the cage, we see Pike conversing with the ship doctor, essentially talking about his temptations to give up the ambitious drive to explore. He's tired of serving as a ship captain. He's tired of all the duties. And it seems that in some sense, his will to power, right? If we want to use the Nietzschean term, his will to power has faded. And the cage presents him with the dilemma where he is tempted essentially to give that up. And what we see in the menagerie is essentially the next step of this, where ultimately we end on I think a delightfully ambiguous conclusion where we see Pike having returned after being terribly mutilated. And taking the deal, because now it's essentially, now it's much more clearly desirable for certain reasons. And we see Kirk refusing it at the same time. But when we conclude the episode, we see Kirk kind of grinning in spite of himself and appreciating to some extent the conclusion that the decision Pike made. So I think the contrast here between Kirk and Pike is really interesting as different approaches to this fundamental problem of will to power, its perils and its promise. And this side of paradise is another great example that connects to some themes of the Dionysian or the demonic in Nietzsche, that there's an affirmation of the temptation to leave Eden, the knowledge that involves, but also this symbol in some way of primordial pagan mythology as being a worthwhile temptation out of this Christian mythos. But I think the Nietzschean lens that I like to think about this in, I want to propose, I guess the reference that I would propose is to Schopenhauer as Educator. And I, instead of seeing this Star Trek as utopian, I would propose seeing it as perfectionist, or an instance of moral perfectionism. So to pick up on the themes that you described there, I think what we have with Star Trek is a point in the human species where civilization has the consensus is that it has reached some level of moral maturity. It's not that Starfleet doesn't make mistakes and doesn't have problems, but as you note, it's a post-scarcity society. People's
It's
needs are
it's
met,
mainly the
and there's
admirals that Starfleet has a problem
the
with, as
conniving
we all know.
admirals, right?
Yes, yeah,
Which,
yeah.
of course, will be, and all of this will, as we'll get into, gets given a more complex moral treatment in Deep Space Nine, probably than other places. But suffice it to say that there's a strong moral code of Starfleet, the Prime Directive, a duty to give amnesty or refuge status, asylum to people who request it, that we see throughout the series. And as you said, we also see that they haven't given up their will to power. Despite having attained some level of moral maturity, they use their morality as a will to power in some way. And Picard is probably the best example of this, where his stubborn insistence on morality and his resolve turns into this active force that can actually defeat more nefarious adversaries. And the perfectionist idea in Nietzsche that comes up in Schopenhauer as Educator, it comes out of the famous passage in that text where Nietzsche says that our life is justified only by living for the good of the greatest exemplars. And people often interpret this, and not without reason, as an argument about how society should be ordered to favor goods being distributed to superior geniuses. The laboring masses then work for their sake. And while this line of thought is pursued in Nietzsche's later work, there's a strong argument to be made by thinkers like James Conant or Stanley Cavell that at this early period, Nietzsche really isn't talking about social institutions, but a sort of relationship of self-overcoming within the soul. And it is a relationship to a possibility of some genius that exemplifies moral perfection. And it comes out of a state of great shame and disappointment at the feeling of corruption and conformity in present culture. Emerson is the main touchstone of this essay for Nietzsche, I think, other than Schopenhauer. And what Nietzsche describes is how living for the sake of the greatest exemplars actually means, in concrete practice, recognizing one's shame before the false culture that you live in. But as Nietzsche says, not feeling distress at it, being able to kind of appraise it impartially and side with one's higher self or one's genius to try to chart a perfectionist path out of corruption towards a higher moral ideal. And I think that Star Trek, to some extent, exemplifies this perfectionist dynamic without the dimension of present corruption. We can see that as built in rather through the kind of contrast that Star Trek presents with the present and the ways that it's interwoven in complex ways with our current politics, or at the time, the 60s politics or the politics of the 90s. And I think that I would propose this as a useful Nietzschean lens for seeing the kind of ambition in Star Trek, a moral will, but not a will to power nonetheless, and one that recognizes that sacrificing certain elements of striving for greatness, ambition, perhaps even war and domination in certain cases, actually sometimes threatens to undermine our ability to be those morally gracious and good human beings that Star Trek imagines us to be.
Interesting. Yeah, there's so many directions I want to go with that. I mean, just the first thing that comes to mind is when you were talking about Picard as this sort of, this force of morality. One of the things that strikes me about the example of Picard is his command of rhetoric. It's not just that he's making oftentimes excellent, rational points or moral points. It's the performative element of the way that Patrick Stewart delivers the lines, the fact that the Picard speech is such a staple of what people love about Star Trek when they talk about TNG, especially. Picard is known for his speeches, and that kind of carries my mind to Nietzsche's attempt to emancipate the sophists from the tarring and feathering that has been heaped upon them. That, in this sort of Socratic dialectical approach, rhetoric is a secondary concern. And if anything, it's a little bit suspect in a way. And we should, be suspicious of the rhetors and the sophists and the people who just teach oratory. But through his power of oratory, Picard sometimes, defeats his enemies with this alone, or the enemies of the Federation, or even within the Federation, like in the Drumhead, people who are attempting to subvert the values of the Federation. And so I find that to be very interesting as well, because it's almost as if Picard is a great example of exactly the value of rhetoric, the way Protagoras says that he actually does instruct young men in ethics, because the best virtue in civic life is oratory, because that's the way that you gain the day. So you shouldn't underestimate rhetoric. The other maybe issue I wanted to look at as regards sort of the interwovenness of the politics of Star Trek with the time in which it's made. So if we go back to the 60s, we see these analogs or allegories for Cold War adversaries within Star Trek. Oftentimes, this Rousseauian romanticism that the show rejects alludes to the hippie movement in some respects. In many ways, the original series is a very liberal show. I mean that in the broad sense, but it's still very fascinating because it points to a kind of hyper liberalism or something. It's a kind of liberalism that affects a self overcoming. It's like through following its own principles through to their ultimate conclusion, it's able to get over a lot of the limitations and the ways in which liberalism inherently fails. And whether or not that's compelling, there are certainly many critics of liberalism. I count myself among them, but I think that in and of itself is a somewhat admirable vision for Roddenberry to portray, because as many who have been critical of liberalism, such as Strauss, have noted, one of the things that's lacking is this sort of narrative. Roddenberry's presenting it with a narrative of this can take us out to the stars. I don't know if you had a reaction to any of
Yeah,
that.
I would
Yeah.
just wanted to emphasize, I think you're picking up exactly what I was trying to suggest previously with the perfectionist theme, because that is often the core theme associated with the perfectionist liberalism or liberal perfectionism, depending on which way you see it. That precisely where liberalism has failed. Well, one of the ways liberalism has failed, and what is most often commented on by more conservative critics, say like communitarians such as McIntyre or Taylor, is that liberalism fails to supply a unifying conception of the good life for the political society it's the governing principle of. And that's a feature, not a bug. Liberalism's strength is that it's neutral, that it abides by the rule of law and public institutions, and does not decide among a substantive conception of the good life. But at the same time, it's what makes liberalism susceptible, not only inherently dissatisfying in certain fundamental ways, existentially, spiritually, ethically, but also susceptible to extreme right wing attempts to return to kind of older ideals, what Nietzsche would take as these kind of old idols, hollowed out idols, reviving previous conceptions of the good life that may no longer be viable, but nonetheless fill a void that liberalism has left. This idea of moral perfectionism, I think you're correct in this respect. I think this is the connection to draw. Star Trek presents this perfectionist vision of liberalism. It is liberalism not as this neutralist, kind of wonkish, administrative, what we've come to associate with the liberalism today, but it's an aspirational liberalism. It's one that imagines an actual concrete vision of the good life that can be legibly mapped onto, as you mentioned, kind of Gene Roddenberry's liberal politics at the time, or later on in different ways in the late 80s and 90s with Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. Um, and I think I think that you've basically laid out exactly why I think Star Trek is politically and ethically interesting for this moment where we're clearly in a crisis of liberalism, where there's open contention for what might replace it ideologically and what might stand in for this missing idea of the good.
Yeah, and I think this dovetails into one of the other themes of the show that I think emerges in the original series, but it's picked up later, even in the films to some extent, although perhaps unfortunately in the films. And it's this idea of God as adversary. Uh, because the way that this ties in is because, again, with the rejection of the return to paradise, it's almost like we're presenting a kind of new spiritual narrative that is in contrast to the old narrative. You're playing with the imagery of Eden and of paradise as this, it frames everything within this conception of we had this good state and it's something that we have to return to. And as you say, there are challenges to liberalism from the right. I think Roddenberry would have seen like the hippie movement or something like that as a challenge from the left. But regardless of whether it's actually consciously articulated, whenever you see a society in Star Trek that is, for example, in the episode The Apple, it's another machine consciousness running the planet that perfectly adjusts all of the weather, the climate. It keeps all the conditions on the planet perfect for the people living there, and apparently is able to make them immortal or something. It's actually not a very well written episode in terms of explaining the whole mythos of what's supposed to be going on this planet. But it's essentially a form of techno primitivism in a way, where you advance to a level where it's like the machine can handle everything, and then we can just be sort of tribal villagers. And I think there was a perception that emerges in the show that even this sort of neutral form of liberalism that I think that's the excellent way to describe it. If it's not aspirational, can sort of insensibly lead you to this. And we're seeing this now. I mean, with AI and automation and all of these things, that when you just have this totally neutral value set, you can just sort of fall into this kind of hedonic, utilitarian, just sort of maximizing pleasure and pain as quantifiable units. And it just becomes about sort of, efficient distribution of goods and services. And eventually, you get like, another critique outside of Star Trek would be like the world of Wall-E, right? That's sort of the nightmare at the end of liberalism if it's not aspirational. And
Actually, I
so,
rewatched Taste of Armageddon from the original series as another example of this. War sublimated into an
yes.
automated system of sanitized, incineration and suicide. The dangers of sublimating that will to power in this efficient administrative way. But go on, please. I just wanted to flag that.
Oh no, that's perfect, and it's again, and it's presented in the logic of the people who do it. This is more civilized because we don't destroy our cities and our art and our culture.
And
And Kirk,
nonetheless, it has gone on for 500 years. Right? The
right,
war
and
has not resolved itself.
that in a strange way could be a Nietzschean point too. That of Kirk pointing out this is actually worse what you're doing by refusing to face up to the reality of what war is. You've made it something much uglier in a way.
I agree.
And
Yeah, I think that's
yeah,
the subtext. It's interesting.
yeah. But
I did want to pick up, if you wouldn't mind, on the
oh, go ahead.
Picard and rhetoric theme that you mentioned, because I do think this helps get at this question of this contest with the gods, which, from a Nietzsche standpoint, always makes me think of Nietzsche's view that the Olympian gods of ancient Greece treated human affairs as this kind of festival where they enjoyed our follies and our misfortunes and all of that, and we were essentially a spectacular performance. And the contrast that jumps out at me in this regard, particularly between Picard and Kirk, is Arena in the original series on the one hand, and Darmok in the Next Generation on the other. Um, what we see in Arena is not just a perfect example of this contest, before the gods, where at the end it's explicit that Kirk is kind of refusing to entertain himself for an entity that looks very much like a Greek, Olympian god. Um, but it also is, to me, a legible case of what the original series often does, which is present Kirk as an Odysseus type. So you can see obvious connections between the Odyssey and the embarking on exploration of the Enterprise, even though Enterprise is forward-looking rather than returning. But we can also see the way certain episodes, I think, in the Odyssey manifest themselves. This Side of Paradise, for example, maps, I think, to the Lotus Eaters episode in the Odyssey, where there's a similar temptation presented, eating these plants that present, causes Odysseus's crew to fall into this soporific state of pure contentment and give up their journey and forget home. Um, Kirk represents this Odysseus type, this Homeric type, in the sense that Odysseus was the man of twists and turns. He was crafty and conniving, and he used his wits to outsmart the gods and deceive them. And that was his talent on his journey home. It is what Adorno and Horkheimer highlight when they want to construe Odysseus as some prototype of bourgeois rational man, right? Instrumentally outwitting the gods. And Kirk, we can see doing similar things in episodes like the Corbomite maneuver, or famously, he emphasized in Wrath of Khan his solution to the no-win scenario of the Kobayashi Maru. And I think that Irina is an example of this, where Kirk is performing for a god, where he has been forced onto a planet into a contest with the Goure captain after having tried to engage in hostilities with the Goure. And Kirk has to rely on his Odyssean craftiness to remember the formula for gunpowder so that he can triumph over the Goure. But at the same time, he must also give mercy. He must refuse to indulge the god's desire to perform by killing the Goure, and that refusal is what ultimately rewards him. It is an assertion of Kirk's craftiness and power, but also a moral decision. Darmok, I think, sometimes seen as like the next generation's answer to Irina in certain ways, I think helpfully highlights how Picard's rhetoric and persuasion operates differently as a type of will to power. If Kirk is the Homeric type, Picard is more the sophistic but practical and political orator. And because he has the responsibility of being a ship captain while he's informed by philosophy and culture, he can't indulge them too far because he's forced to make difficult decisions. And he has to, as you say, make this kind of performative commitment to morality that has a kind of relationship of exemplarity. Picard is presenting himself as an example. He's practicing what he preaches, and that is what makes his message so convincing. I think Who Watches the Watchers, where Picard goes through, he actually puts himself in great danger, taking an arrow to the chest to convince a planet of people that he's not, in fact, a god, is an example of this kind of rhetorical persuasion by example. And the same kind of thing happens in Darmok. Instead of a contest with the gods, we have this refashioned as a contest of Picard trying to forge a link of understanding with an alien species for whom the universal translator fails. They seem to be saying legible English words per the universal translator, but they are combined grammatically in unrecognizable ways.
One of the like memes. It would be like if aliens saw our memes. We would be saying to the aliens, Picard, his hand over his face, and they wouldn't know what we're talking about. But yeah.
Yeah, and if you've seen Lower Decks, they riff on that a fair amount with the Darmok meme jokes. But in this case, I think one thing that it highlights as an essential point of ancient rhetoric that Socrates misses is the need to make the right pitch to the right audience, and that isn't some artificial manipulative thing. You actually have to forge some common understanding, some kind of fusion of horizons in order to find the right rhetorical strategy. So in Darmok, we see Picard struggling against this challenge where he's supposed to work cooperatively, but doesn't know because he can't communicate. And he's trying to protect his ship while also deciphering this language. And he saves the day not by the same kind of Odyssean craftiness of making gunpowder, but by achieving understanding, by finally decoding the language and being able to communicate at the last minute to prevent conflict. And I think this is in addition to just seeing the kind of mythological themes of the original series, I've sort of think this comparison helps me kind of sort through the different ways in which the original series and the next generation vary this core theme of Trek that we're kind of circling around.
Yeah, and I think, well, for one, in Who Watches the Watchers, I rewatched that episode recently, and the scene where Picard, they have a Federation representative who is down on the planet, and he suggests, just be a god, just instruct and guide these people. And Picard's reaction is so solidly against that, and it reminded me of just how, I don't want to say anti-religious, but perhaps that is the best word, that there is a very palpable anti-religious theme beneath Star Trek, at least as a way of Not in terms of like intolerance toward religion, but uh, there are a lot of notions these days coming from certain public intellectuals that we need Christianity as a guide to our lives, and that's the solution for liberalism, for example. And that is something that Star Trek roundly rejects. And I think a great example of the difference you bring up with Picard confronting a god versus, say, Kirk is the confrontation with Q at the very beginning of Next Generation. And this was a theme, as I mentioned, that sort of was picked up from the original series. It even occurs in one of the films when they literally meet God and the center of the universe. And but there's this theme of a godlike being that shows up and tells the crew of the Enterprise, I mean, Q's words are, "You have proceeded far enough into the galaxy already. You are an immature, childlike race." And so there's this condemnation of humanity on the basis of past evils, wrongs that have been committed by humanity. Q literally recreates a past age of humanity that does not look very good for mankind's record, and then puts humanity on trial within that period. That's part of the pilot, and then even at the end of Next Generation, he says the trial never ends. By that point, the significance of Q and what he means has significantly changed, and he's become more of a helpful, almost like Loki type figure, rather than a representation of the Christian God. But I
Well, to
think
be
that
clear,
that's
also, he's a completely absurd representation of the Christian God
a-
throughout. So they're just
absolutely, absolutely. Well, I think what he's representing is, if not the Christian God himself, a sort of, again, that sentiment that human beings are fundamentally flawed, whether or not we speak in the language of we're sinful. We have certain uh, fundamental flaws that cannot be overcome. And because of that, not only should we be made to feel guilty for these things, but that should halt our desire to continue proceeding beyond our horizons now. And all of that, to me, is very congenial to Nietzsche's ideas about the way in which our pre-existing morality circumscribes our even our metaphysical understanding of the world and our perceptions. Nietzsche's project of Selbstüberwindung, of self-overcoming, and the overman idea, the notion of humanity getting over its the petty aspects, the aspects of our psychology that involve guilt and bad conscience and ressentiment, and the ascetic ideal. Imagining a form of humanity, a form of health that is beyond that. That entire prospect, I mean, Nietzsche himself points out, within the existing religious framework is seen as an evil thing. And so he says in his notes for Thus Spoke Zarathustra, well, the first thing I have to do is make war on the existing morality, because the existing morality, not only does it put us within this metaphysics of being and all of these other problems, it prevents from the outset any possibility of even affecting a revaluation. That in and of itself is immoral, because as Nietzsche points out, all of the great legislators of value, as he called them, had to. There's an element of art or artistic creativity that involves in a legislation of values, and that element of creativity is seen within the existing morality as sort of a deception or something like that. Like you're not being entirely honest, and so that sort of is the way in which, for me, that plays into the background of what's perhaps going on with a lot of these god figures. To relate it back to the original series, one of the figures they actually meet is the god Apollo, who, it's sort of like, if anyone's seen Stargate SG-1, it's a similar logic that the gods, ancient gods, were actually really powerful aliens, and they came down to Earth. And they meet Apollo, who's like, I was one of the Olympian gods, and I want you to worship me again. Go be goat herds and play the lyre. And again, it's this sort of Rousseauian vision, or romantic neo-pagan vision. It very much reminds me of, the kinds of things that the Shelleys and Keats and Thomas Love Peacock were dreaming about. They would have been right at home on that planet. And again, Kirk and the crew, that there's no it's never entertained whether or not that would be a good idea for mankind. This is the adversary. This is the mental thing that's keeping us back, is wanting to subordinate ourselves to some sort of retrograde moral idea that's going to keep us within a set state. And so that becomes a figure that has to be routinely challenged. And as you point out, Picard does it with Q. Well, he kind of does it performatively by getting out of the test in the first episode. But there are so many great speeches that Picard gives to Q. That is a being that could completely like snap his fingers and disintegrate Picard if he wanted to. Is a being with limitless power. Another great example is Where Silence Has Lease, a very creepy episode from season 2 of Next Generation,
You'll
where
have
they
to remind me of
encountered
that one because I actually don't remember that one.
they encounter this alien intelligence called Nagilum that traps them in this weird part of space, and he basically declared it's like a giant baby face, kind of stretched out
Okay,
weird
no,
on
I do remember now.
the view
Yeah,
screen, and he says, I haven't encountered finite beings. I'm going to kill, like a third of your crew in all sorts of different ways to see how you die and see what it's like for you to face death as a sort of experiment. And again, it's like this, it's a remarkable conceit for a story to have a character like Picard look that being in the eye and say, "No, I will fight you. I will destroy my ship before we do that." Of being sort of fearless in the face of something that appears to be totally omnipotent is another enduring theme of the show. But yeah.
and I think also the way in which that particular moment represents refusing a kind of crass utilitarianism of just saving the rest of the crew while sacrificing some, but not in a way that is just kind of abstract idealism, that nonetheless represents kind of this kind of realistic brinksmanship and confrontation with the entity that he's grappling with. I guess I wanted to pick up on two of the themes that you mentioned here. One would be the anti-religion question, the role of religion in Star Trek, and mentioning who watches the Watchers and Picard, the question of being a god for this people. Um, and the second is Q, and particularly the pilot of the Encounter at Farpoint episode of Next Generation, and this issue of, are we ready to actually emerge into these kinds of parts of the universe? As when it comes to the first theme, I think it's interesting because I don't necessarily read Picard as refusing religion per se, but refusing arrogating himself the kind of authority that a god maybe purports to have. And you can say that that's complex, right? There's religions that emphasize that authority strong theological dogma, like versions of Christianity, and there are others that have less kind of authoritarian intent. But in this respect, Picard reminds me of Zarathustra in some ways, and a figure who wants others to go their own way and emulate him in his example, but not instruct them dogmatically. Which is also a similar perfectionist theme that emerges in Schopenhauer as Educator. And I think
And
this might be go ahead.
really
Yeah,
quick interjection, that's the morality of the Federation with the Prime Directive, is we do
right. And
not
this is
want to
central.
guide any of these civilizations. Yeah.
Right, which is also then I think the question of what kinds of moral dilemmas the Starfleet encounters out in the cosmos that force them to revise inflexible rules. The number of times that Picard is forced to some extent, soften or break the Prime Directive. The fact that the Prime Directive is there does not somehow obviate the need to make judgments in particular cases. One thing simply to flag, though, on the religion front, if we're going to talk about this in Trek, we must, of course, talk about my personal favorite captain, Benjamin Sisko, also known as the emissary to the prophets. And Deep Space Nine certainly, I think, presents, because Bajor is so, arguably the Bajorans are defined by two things, their religiosity and the fact that they've suffered under the Cardassian occupation that has ended only recently when we start Deep Space Nine. But I think that's probably where we get the most mature treatment of religion in a more complex instance of a captain that is implicated directly in some kind of visionary experience. The second point, though, regarding Q, I think there might be two ways of reading the warning that Q issues to Picard in this episode. One would be the question you highlighted of being constrained by some kind of old existing Christian morality that might restrict our will to go out and explore. But I think there is a more tragic Nietzschean perspective that emphasizes the theme of hubris, because I see in some ways, I see Q's warning to Picard as kind of the old maps where once you get at the edges, it says here there be dragons. These are the unknown territory where the human species, despite all their ingenuity and virtue, might inevitably find themselves overmatched. And to some extent, Q is not just testing their worthiness as a species, because of course a recurring theme is whether humans are essentially violent or can overcome violent tendencies in moral ways, but also testing whether they're worthy to confront what's out there being ultimately the Borg. Because I think this is the I guess it's Q who, when we first introduce the Borg, is I think the moment where Q says, well, forget it. I'm just going to make you confront what's out there now. I've gotten frustrated. Now we're going to show you the Borg and show you how overmatched you are. But they're overmatched not just technologically, they're forced to confront a situation that doesn't conform to moral expectations that they might already have. The kinds of norms of respect that Starfleet kind of adamantly extends to every other species they encounter can't be extended to the Borg in the same way. The series, of course, goes on to complicate this in many ways, but to me, it kind of gives an example of how we can read Q's warning as almost sort of mapping the contest of wills to power of humanity versus the unexplored space of the cosmos, and testing what we're actually adequate and up to, both in terms of our power and capacity, but also in terms of the moral code we adopt and whether it's robust and flexible enough to adapt to all of the exotic, strange situations we encounter in exploring space. That, of course, become even more exotic when we get to the Delta Quadrant and the Gamma Quadrant and all of that, because Picard's only in the Alpha Quadrant anyway. But
Yeah, but maybe before we get on to talk about Deep Space Nine, we maybe we should talk about the Borg a little bit. I think
yeah,
on what you said, I think that's insightful. I think to maybe look at it from a meta perspective, just on Q, I think that there was a lot going on with just maybe the way the writers were thinking about Q that developed over the course of the show. Because by the time you get to Tapestry, it's very clear that he's still testing humanity, still testing Picard, but you get the sense he wants him to overcome the test.
yes,
Whereas it's more ambiguous in Encounter at Farpoint. And I think the reason I read it that way is because of Gene Roddenberry's sort of past incarnations of this idea in different forms.
no, I
And
agree.
so
I
it's
think that's
interesting
it's
that
helpful
it,
context.
yeah, I think it's interesting that it develops and becomes, which in a way it's also very Nietzschean as well, that it's the tension, it's the struggle between, like he says at the beginning of the preface to Beyond Good and Evil, the struggle against Platonism has given us the most tensely strained bow by which we can shoot for the farthest goals. And he says, of course, Christianity is Platonism for the people. So I'm not here to unbend the bowstring as they've tried to do in the past. We have these dogmatic errors, but we should be grateful to those errors because, in the case of Star Trek, maybe that will lead us out to the stars as being tested against whether or not you're going to subordinate yourself to a God idea or retreat because you don't think humanity can sublate itself or overcome itself. But on the question of the Borg, as you say, the Federation's not able to interact with them. One reason is rhetoric doesn't work on the Borg. There is it would be futile to try and reason with them. In fact, Q says this when he's introducing them to the Borg. Your diplomacy is not going to work. None of your normal techniques in your toolbox are going to apply to the Borg. But the interesting thing about the Borg is, I wonder your kind of take on the Borg as, coming from the left perspective, because certainly the Borg are like collectivist in perhaps the most extreme sense. They're also perfectionists. You could say if the Federation has a perfectionist idea of liberalism, the Borg would say we're also looking for perfection, but it's a kind of perfection that in which individuality is completely null and void. So I would wonder, like, how do you sort of see the Borg, or like what critique is being made there by the show, or how do you interpret and interact with that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question because you're no doubt correct to see the Borg as another incarnation of some of these themes that you already mentioned in the original series. It's not just that the original series has a certain liberal individualistic kind of bent. It's also legibly anti-communist in certain moments, right? I mean, I think there are very clear ways in which some of the scenarios we've been talking about of giving up, aspiration for some kind of life of contentment are also a critique that's leveled against the Soviet Union. The enterprise, of course, is a capitalist economic term in many ways, and I think when we first introduced the Klingons, they are very Soviet in the way they're represented, even though they later, I think, particularly starting in the movies, developed to become the Klingons as we recognize them when we get to
Yet
Worf.
the initial Klingon portrayal is very, very different from even later episodes in the
Yeah,
original series, where they're talking about the Klingon military governor's talking about this list of crimes against the state, and they have like a mind scanner that can interrogate you through technology. It doesn't seem very Klingon. That's something we
yeah,
associate
no.
with Romulans later. They're not usually talking about crimes against the state. So it's like a very different portrayal that definitely seems more Soviet or Chinese communist or something like that.
Yeah, we don't get the like intense warrior honor ethos until at least the original series movies, but definitely more so with Worf's character arc in Next Generation and later Deep Space Nine. Uh, but I think the to connect this to the Borg, I think you can see the Borg as a manifestation of a similar theme. Again, we have a collectivity that seems to rob humanity of some of its aspirational goals, but nonetheless does pursue its own picture of perfection, but explicitly so. They need to assimilate everything to achieve perfection. But I think part of the problem here is the question of what the goal of that perfection ought to be. I think the Nietzschean metaphor of pulling back the bowstring and maintaining its tension is perfect because the purpose of doing so is to shoot at the farthest goal. But the Borg may claim to have a goal, but it's also a self defeating one. The goal is further assimilation. The goal is to add other species' perfection to their own. There's no point at which that perfection would be finally achieved, unless presumably they've assimilated every species in the universe. At which point it's anyone's guess what the Borg would then do or occupy themselves with, or what would give meaning to their lives. So there is, I think, a interpretation of what is self-contradictory in certain ways about this desire to assimilate and expand at all cost that eliminates individuality. But at the same time, it represents this formidable challenge. Well, I would say two things. It represents a formidable challenge that typical Starfleet strategies and morality seem unable to overcome, and in fact end up being extremely costly when Picard is himself assimilated to great negative consequences. But we also have Seven of Nine in Voyager. We also have some of the further developments of machinic consciousness throughout Star Trek, like the Doctor, where things get more complicated in terms of incorporating the perspective of a simulation or the perspective of a rehabilitated Borg. But I think that the question of Borg morality, then, or the dilemma it presents, to me, the figure that actually best allows us to understand the Borg is Janeway in Voyager. And the reason I say that is I tend to think of the captains as each having their own kind of superpower. And we've talked about Picard's and Kirk's being his craftiness and ability to win the no-win scenario. Picard, his moral character. Cisco's superpower is that he, might get his Cardassian tailor to murder you. And then Janeway's is that she's a little bit mad. Janeway is the one who's willing to absolutely go to the mat, to the point where most anybody else, even the most kind of experienced captains, say, no, that's too far. That's just bonkers. But then manages to find a way out of it. And in Scorpion, the Voyager episode where Seven of Nine is first introduced, we see Janeway actually making a deal with the Borg in the way that one would make a deal with the devil. Of course, this presupposes a situation where the Borg are facing a greater threat than that even they can't handle. But it presents this dilemma of the scorpion and the frog. I think a different animal in the in the metaphor in the show, but what do you do when you try to make a deal with the scorpion who tells you he'll carry you, who tells you he wants you to carry you across the river, but then stings you anyway, and you both drown? How do you make a deal with the Borg? Well, Janeway succeeds in this, but she succeeds by indulging a certain form of madness, by doing something that is flatly irrational. What everybody else tells her is irrational, and taking an extreme risk that nobody thinks could work out. And I think that's actually interesting as a Nietzschean kind of theme of how one might conquer a Borg like adversary. Maybe morality of any kind is insufficient. Maybe even Picard's moral will to power. Maybe to confront the Borg, we need a still further figure of the Dionysian superabundance of life and its madness to counter the like machinic will to assimilate.
Yeah, you need a captain fueled entirely by large doses of coffee, driven into a Dionysian excitation.
Yes, always sympathize with Janeway's dilemma of the replicator rations and the need for a constant stream of coffee. That's absolutely where I would be in that situation.
Yeah, yeah. Um, well, let's talk about Deep Space Nine then, and
Yeah,
because the issue of religion in Deep Space Nine, I think, is really fascinating, and I think it does represent a shift compared to the way that religion is handled in previous iterations of Star Trek. And I think I've brought this up to you before. Maybe it was in a tweet I made or something like that. I see the defining moment of Deep Space Nine as the moment where it's the beginning plot arc of season six. They're retaking Deep Space Nine from the Dominion. The Dominion are also they're a theocracy essentially because their founders are worshipped as gods. They're also a eugenicist empire who believes that they should have a strict hierarchy and actually edit the genomes of their subjects to more adequately fit their roles within this perfect order that they're trying to create. There's also a really interesting aspect of this that the beings that are trying to create order are themselves shapeshifters. They are fluid and they have no set form, but they want to manipulate the genetics of their subjects, the
they
solids, to be.
deeply distrust the solids, right? This is a
Yes,
significant difference.
yes, and so that's who they're fighting, and they've basically been defeating the federal, not defeating them, but they've had the Federation on the ropes for a significant period of time, and they're finally doing this counteroffensive to take back the station. And in the end, they're not going to get there in time. They put up a minefield to stop the Dominion coming through the wormhole. Ultimately, they fight a brave battle. It turns out in the end, they do overcome the Dominion forces and reinforcements are on the way, but Cisco doesn't know that yet. The Defiant gets there to the mouth of a wormhole. The minefield's been taken down. The Dominion fleet's about to come in. So he goes into the wormhole where the prophets live, who are the beings that the Bajorans worship as gods, who are these beings outside of time and space. And Cisco makes the argument to them, if you want to be gods, then be gods. You've created this whole religion around yourselves. The Bajorans worship you as gods. You've made me your emissary. Well, in that case, I'm calling in a favor. I need you to stop that Dominion fleet, or else Bajor will be destroyed. They do it. There's this whole thing of a penance where Cisco's going to have to sort of pay for this later. But ultimately, I thought that was a defining moment in the show because the way I read that whole situation is almost what really saves the day is the fact that the whole reason why Cisco goes into the wormhole in the first place and the reason why he has bargaining power with the prophets is because he says, okay, we're the only ship here. We're just going to go and fight them. We will sacrifice ourselves and go down in a blaze of glory to stop the worst evil from coming and taking over the Federation, destroying our entire way of life. I'm willing to die, to martyr myself in the name of the values of the Federation. And upon that moment, literal gods appear to him and he's able to bargain with them for their freedom. And it's almost the way I read that is it's the point in which a Star Trek show acknowledges that there has to be some sort of truly religious myth and something kind of irrational, that value of being willing to Throw away your life, throw away your instinct for self-preservation in the name of values beyond yourself. And that intervention by the prophets, which they do intervene, and the Federation is effectively saved by
Mhm.
gods. It's I have always found that to be a very interesting sort of, I wouldn't call it a subversion, but again, like turning some
Yeah.
of the things that have been established, the themes of the show, on its head.
Yeah. Well, I'm very happy that you brought it up. We did, I think, at one point go back and forth briefly. Sacrifice of Angels, the episode you have in mind, is actually, if I had to pick, I would say it is my single favorite episode of Star Trek. I understand that there are others that are more often seen as like the very best of the series. One of the things that Sacrifice of Angels did for me is that it is really the culmination of lengthy storylines really starting in earnest around the beginning of season 3, but that have developed throughout several seasons and that all come to a satisfying resolution, a temporary resolution, some kind of conclusion together and pay off. Star Trek had never really done that before, right? Both the original series and Next Generation were episodic in form. There wasn't much in the way of arcs or through lines aside from some character arcs like Worf's, that the narrative of Worf's dishonor and his father, but Deep Space Nine really goes in for the serial storytelling, and to me, that's the episode, and that's typically the kind of like TV I prefer, and that was the episode that really paid it off. But I think you helped make a connection though about that episode that I hadn't quite made before, because I agree, this is one of the most earned Deus Ex Machina moments that I can think of in fiction, not just because the gods, the Bajoran gods, and the prophets are there from the very beginning in the first episode of Deep Space Nine. But as you say, this is reaching back to these start themes of the contest before the gods that are as old as Star Trek is, that go back to the beginning. And in some ways, it's Star Trek calling its own bluff, as you say. We always have these super powerful entities in the universe, but usually they only show up for an episode, or in Q's case, a few episodes, and then go away before more reasonable, tractable dilemmas are confronted. But Sisko's radical sacrifice there, I think, is what I would say what distinguishes him morally and makes him, for me, the most interesting of the captains. And I would read Sacrifice of Angels kind of juxtaposed with In the Pale Moonlight in this respect, which is one of the most famous episodes of Deep Space Nine, where we see Sisko uh, morally compromising himself in the most serious way that he does probably throughout the entire series. But when we see when you see what he does in Sacrifice of Angels, it's not just an empty sacrifice. As you mentioned, not only have the prophets put significant importance on him as their emissary and seem to place significant importance on Bajor, but he's effectively making this needless gesture, a gesture that would be purely symbolic if it wasn't for his full absolute commitment to the risk and recognition of what he's doing is hopeless, and the fact that he is really truly just exposing himself before the gods. I think maybe the figure I think of here is perhaps how Kierkegaard describes Abraham and the kind of mad dilemma of faith that goes beyond rational limits. But I think it's only because Sisko is capable of that dramatic self-effacement, that leap of faith, that he earns the right. I mean, I won't call it the right, but earns the right to also sometimes be the semi-corrupt captain who does the morally dubious thing when it needs to get done that Picard would never do, and that Kirk might find some super clever way of getting around. But that Sisko does have to bite the bullet and make the hard political and moral choices, but that he compensates for that perhaps by his unique religious faith among the different, and maybe, perhaps faith is the wrong word, the religious role that is thrust upon him and that he must then come to take seriously. And there is a sacrifice. Ultimately, the sacrifice is that the cost of this request is that Sisko will never get to enjoy his dream of settling on Bajor as his adoptive planet. That he ultimately dies in the sorry, spoiler alert. I assume if you're watching this, you haven't, or then you've seen the ending of Deep Space Nine, and you weren't like me a couple years ago. But he has to make that sacrifice in a definitive and final way. And I think that's the interesting dialectic of Cisco morally as a character, the sins and evils that he's willing to accommodate, but at the same time, the radical moral faith that he exhibits in other moments.
Yeah, I think that's brilliantly put. I do wonder what, because it's something I have puzzled over with Deep Space Nine as to how we, like, assuming that we hold to the Federation values, right? How are we supposed to take the Bajoran religion and the worship of the prophets? Because there is that sort of standard, prime directive ethos. That's their way of doing things. We are not here to impose our worldview on you. The problems with that are sort of revealed at the end of season one, where you have, at the time, Vedic Wynn, who is this religious extremist who can't tolerate the children being taught. It's sort of like a intelligent design episode, perhaps, is the issue of the day that's being reflected there.
One with O'Brien's wife, whose name is
Keiko.
Keiko. What Keiko? Yes, when Keiko
Yes.
becomes the school teacher and yeah, has the intelligent design controversy
Right.
on
Yeah.
Facebook,
Yeah.
right?
Of the
Yeah,
whether or not the wormhole is intelligently designed as the question. Well, I guess they admit it is. It's just, are they gods or not is really the issue. It's an issue of interpretation. And so we see the positive sides and the negative sides of the Bajoran religion. We see how Kira says it's the one thing that unified us and motivated us all to be together to resist this occupation under a brutal dictatorship. But at the same time, we repeatedly see how even within the Bajorans, who are people that we like, they're our friends, but they're routinely motivated to do things that are kind of deranged or make no sense, from our perspective. If we're inhabiting the perspective of the Federation, and then it's that sort of contrasted with the fact that the Dominion is again like a theocratic religious body. And come to think of it, I don't know if there's really another like major threat in Star Trek that is a religious organization. They don't often play up like the Church of the Founders, but they call them gods over and over again.
yeah. I
And
think it's interesting that Trek doesn't present a future where religion is totally missing. That even a
mm,
logical race like the Vulcans still has all of this really intense ritual. In some sense, they have to have a religious commitment to being, or like a religious passion level commitment to being logical in order to sustain it. But you're right. I mean, the Dominion is, I mean, arguably the biggest single threat that Starfleet faces throughout most of this, like, the various shows. But I can't think of another one that fits that description, as you've mentioned.
yeah, well, and it's actually probably the Dominion maps most clearly onto what we would call like the retrograde forms of rightism today in
Yeah.
terms of the eugenicism and the religious element and order. Ultimately, order is the highest value. That's sort of like the deep vibes level
Hmm.
of this threat. And so it's maybe the way to think about it. I don't know that it's kind of just coming to mind here is like there is that ordering or that the communitarian function of religion that it in Bajor's case during the occupation is very beneficial for them. And the Dominion, again, is a perfectionist extreme of order, of just solely order. That's our value. And it's also born out of a kind of ressentiment on the part of the founders, who are essentially traumatized by their treatment in at the hands of the solids. And it's explicitly stated they will not be able to hurt us if we control all of them, if we are totally in control. And it's a very, therefore, reactive and outward facing, fear based morality that their entire civilization is based on. And so maybe that's a way to grapple with it is it really matters what sort of values are being, what forces are seizing your religion. They could be forces that are, in the case of the Bajorans, emancipatory. It's still ordering and
For sure.
communitarian,
Yeah.
but in the case of the Dominion, it's a force of domination, purely
Yeah.
domination.
I think sometimes with Nietzsche, I instead of talking about value or values, I like the idea of valuation that Deleuze
Mm,
particularly picks up on because it implies that this active mode where it's not just about what the value is or says in some abstract sense. It is, as you say, what forces seize control of it. And different forms of valuation, active and reactive, slave and master, et cetera, might take the same value, moral value, and adapt it to radically different modes of judgment in particular cases and forms of political ordering. And I do think the Dominion is a great example of that. We have Odo's character as the one of the members of the Great Link who has been sent off alone to learn about other life in the universe. And we eventually learn that other Odos have reached the conclusion that solids are not to be trusted and thus must be prophylactically destroyed by the Dominion. So I agree, it is this ressentiment focused initiative that I think gives a different, more fascistic spin to the homogenization collectivity question. We do have the link blending into one side, the liquid, and sharing consciousness, and we also see how that becomes a problem for Odo later in the show when he starts to get back in touch with the Great Link, but also experiences this depersonalization where he loses his attachment to Kira and his interest in the world and interest in others, and has to, in the same episode that we were discussing, Sacrifice of Angels, has to kind of recover himself just in time. But I think that to, I guess, jump for there, hopefully not too abruptly, to the religion question. I agree that what's interwoven here is a kind of more mature exploration of political themes at the edge of the Starfleet territory we previously considered. Sisko is immediately inserted into a highly political situation. On the one hand, the Prime Directive doesn't apply, not just because Bajor and Cardassians are both, I believe, warps. I guess I can't remember where they say, but I think warp species. Um, but they've been invited in to kind of oversee this negotiated settlement where the Cardassians are retreating from the century-long occupation of Bajor. And I think you're exactly right. The main kind of positive role of Bajoran religion is this as this reserve of strength and unity against a entirely tyrannical and genocidal kind of occupation. Um, if there is one kind of species that I think is presented in the most unambiguously bad terms, although Garrick will be the kind of clear exception or complicating case to this, it's the Cardassians. Um, but we do see, as Deep Space Nine goes on, these drawbacks of the Bajorans' kind of anti-science tendencies, their knee-jerk dogmatism, and the way that complicates education, the way they tend to promote corrupt clerics that then eventually, she's a great example of the priestly class in many ways in Nietzsche, I think, and later falls for Ducat's disguise to disastrous effects. Um, but I think that I think there is an interesting interplay here, which is we do have a mature understanding of the distinctive challenges of being occupied by an invading, in this case, species or army, nation, what have you. And we see how moral compromises are necessary. I mean, Deep Space Nine, as a long prior to September 11th, does not shy away from describing Kira as a terrorist or previously a terrorist, and certainly doesn't present it as just straightforwardly unjustified. It presents this complex scenario, but I think we also get a bit more of some more interesting wrinkles on how the directions the religion takes them later on. I think the moment that jumps out to me is the episode. The name of the episode is escaping me. It is when Bajor is negotiating the treaty to join the Federation, but Sisko has a revelation, communes with the prophets, and rushes in to say, don't join the Federation. Why? Well, because instead Bajor signs the non-aggression pact with the Dominion, and doesn't then get obliterated immediately as a member of the Federation as soon as the Dominion goes through the wormhole. And in retrospect, this seems like a totally obvious move. Of course, Bajor is like right on the front lines at the other end of the wormhole for whenever the Dominion invades. But it is an interesting wrinkle, I think, where the continued connection to religion and prophecy shakes up the considerations of politics in complicated ways. This rational negotiation is suddenly disrupted by this big manifestation of Bajor's enduring religious faith. And the consequences are paradoxical. On the one hand, it's pretty obvious from the standpoint there, even despite the reasons I outlined, that it's presented as an irrational thing, that Sisko has come in with this vision and that it would be kind of crazy to trust him on this. But the results are ultimately probably beneficial for Bajor and fundamentally changed the calculus, in particular of how contested Deep Space Nine is as a location in the later episodes we've discussed. So I think it's Ronald D. Moore, also Battlestar Galactica. I think if people have watched his remake of Battlestar Galactica, you see a similar kind of more gritty exploration of moral and political dilemmas from a sci-fi perspective that still retains a kind of stronger moral commitment. But I also think it often tends to give a kind of overall critical picture without necessarily coming to a more decisive moral resolution like we get in Picard's great speeches.
Yeah, yeah. Just a side note on something when you were talking about the changelings. It's funny because there's this meme now that goes around that Odo is a fascist. And part of that's because he's a cop and he's always saying, I want to
Because he's
declare
the
martial law.
collaborator, right? Yeah.
Right, right. But it's interesting to me that when he meets the founders, he directly rebukes them and says, I seek justice, and this is not justice. And that difficulty of their sole value or valuation of order versus his conception of justice, which they would say has been tainted by the insidious Federation ideas, but he's onboarded this again this moral perfectionism that's
Mm-hmm.
perhaps working through this like inherent desire for order or something that perhaps his species has inculcated into
Yeah.
themselves.
He's another great example of the recurring theme of with Trek of how the characters that are not human are the ones that nonetheless seem to teach us the most about our humanity, whether it's Odo or Data or Spock originally. And you're right that I think a lot of people, and it's not just people viewers of Star Trek, but this is an ongoing problem in the show. During the occupation, Odo collaborated with the Cardassian occupiers, at least in his role as the head of security of the station. And that has left gnawing resentment by some of the Bajorans, some of the other occupants of the station, and the Bajorans. But Odo's the reasons that Odo did this, and also the reasons that he starts to behave as he does once Sisko takes command and start to mature in certain ways, are very complex. And I think the point of order is really the point to look at. There's a question of how much morality requires a certain degree of law and order. And let's distinguish between the two as law being some more formalization of moral principles, where order being some actual like social and often coercive kind of ordering or organization of those. And I think what Odo is an example of is somebody who does place genuine moral significance on order in a way that does lead him into some pitfalls, but does not have any of that hidden need to dominate and inflict cruelty that order is so often the mask of, the excuse for. Uh, that it is just a regime imposing an arbitrary organization to punish that which is deviant or different, and thus to give vent to human desires for cruelty. Odo is truly committed in ways that often compromise him and just generally make him an extremely grumpy and difficult guy to get along with. But it is a genuine moral commitment to that I think is explored in interesting ways. And to me, what complicates the collaborator narrative is that I don't think it's portrayed, it certainly isn't excused in the show, in my view. I think it's an ongoing point of conflict. And there is a kind of prevailing sense that there is some way in which Odo was complicit. But at the same time, it doesn't seem to uh, negate his strength of character in the same way it does for more nefarious kind of villains. We do still come away feeling like Odo has this genuine, strong ethical commitment to an aspirational vision of order that isn't just an excuse for inflicting cruelty on the subjugated, but does represent his kind of peculiar and idiosyncratic ethos that will always have Quark as its other, the charming and likable disruptor of ords.
Yeah, yeah. Well, because of course Odo was, I think of the episode where they find the Jem'Hadar baby. And
Mm-hmm.
Odo was a laboratory experiment himself, and he doesn't want this kid, even though he's a genetically engineered super soldier, to go be a laboratory experiment like he was. And that reminds me of Deleuze as well, where he sort of he I'm going to paraphrase this and probably butcher it, but in Nietzschean philosophy, he sort of takes issue with people who see the slave morality as like a purely historical phenomenon that
Mm-hmm.
it just purely comes out of you were oppressed and then therefore you adopt the slave morality, because the will to power interprets. Different people will interpret what's happened to them in different ways. The key for Deleuze is this reactive psychological thought pattern, or however we want to put it,
Mm.
which source to impulses. But, you know, so we might say the founders say, we were mistreated, therefore we're going to mistreat everyone else. Odo's logic is, I'm going to prevent other people from being mistreated in the way that I was. There's nothing that determines Odo to behave in that domineering manner just from his past experiences. He still makes the choice. And I think even as a collaborator, they explore, I mean, I think of the episode like Necessary Evil, where it's like he kind of lets Kira get away with, it's kind of applied. He wasn't like on the Oscar Schindler level, but he would like
Yeah.
let the Bajoran, like he used his role to help people who were innocent. And
Yes.
so I think he can, I think the people who will call Odo like fascist or whatever are giving him a bad rap. But
Yeah, that's
yeah, sorry.
entirely. I mean, I think that's deeply unfair, and I
Yeah.
love Odo, so I'm not gonna. I won't tar his reputation with such associations.
But
Um,
speaking of actual fascists, to within the logic of the show,
yeah.
another topic I did want to get to would be the likes of, for example, Khan, Noonien Singh, and
Hmm.
other superhuman type characters. And I believe it was the second pilot of the show. So it's interesting. The first pilot, The Cage, we have this sort of theme that can be interpreted in a very Nietzschean way, insofar as the refusal of getting lost in this dream world and just becoming the sort of the tools, the technicians of this super intelligent race and living in a dream. The idea that no, we need struggle and all of these things. The next pilot that they make, where no man has gone before, uh, it involves this idea of they like pass this energy barrier at the edge of the galaxy, and then Kirk's old school friend it becomes endowed with super telekinetic powers that by the end of the episode are reaching godlike proportions. And he immediately is corrupted by this power and wants to, he's telling Jim, pray to me. I'm going to be your new god. And it's interesting, a little philosophical nugget in that episode that I've always enjoyed. Kirk walks in and he finds Mitchell reading Spinoza, and he's surprised by this. He says, "You, Spinoza?" And he says, "Well, it's almost once you get into him, he's a little childish. Actually, I don't agree with him at all." Which is it's
Sure.
kind of
The kinds
interesting.
of philosophical references they used to drop in television, and how dumbed down so much of it
Yeah, I
seems by
know.
comparison
I
nowadays. But
know.
yes, please go on.
Yeah, well, and I found that interesting. I think the first time I saw the episode, I'd never read Spinoza, but it's like not only is it supposed to show that he's overcoming humanity because this geometric, super complex philosophy is easy for him, but it's also like the morality of Spinoza and the idea of God as nature. That's sort of what Einstein said is I believe in the God of Spinoza. We can kind of see
Mhm.
this sort of like again scientific futurist mindset as sort of coming to believe in this kind of deist or pantheist god, perhaps, and that in a way it's sort of like he's rejecting all of that. It's like, oh, that's just childish human stuff. I'm above the human now. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we get Khan later in Space Seed as this character who, again, is feels that he is genetically superior to human beings. And that theme to me seemed to be almost a repudiation of the Nietzschean idea. You could read it as, perhaps it's, that would be the image of Khan is the wrong way to read Nietzsche's Overman idea, which I would personally agree with. But I do get the sense that there is something in the show that is wants to be guarded against this
Mhm.
idea of overcoming humanity, at least in certain ways. And I don't know. I was wondering if you
I
have
think
any
that's right.
reaction to
And I
that.
think you're right to say I don't read Nietzsche that way, but I think it's fair to say that Nietzsche is more willing to entertain something like the Khan Noonien Singh
Hmm.
approach than certainly Star Trek is, where I think what we've kind of been exploring throughout this is how Star Trek does take certain Nietzschean themes that I've been sort of grouping under the heading of perfectionism, but try to work them into are something more like a liberal moral understanding, rather than entertaining the temptations of fascism. And these explicitly represent Earth's past, the eugenic wars that
Mm.
preceded the invention of warp and the birth of Starfleet. Actually, I don't remember where the invention of warp stands, but that's not important right now. The suggestion that there are certain fundamentally pathological or self-contradictory ways of attaining that kind of greater human maturity, I do think is a persistent theme throughout the show. And I guess the way I would think about it, I would mention two references for this concept. One is in Aristotle in the first book of the Politics, when he says that the polis, the space of politics, exists neither for beast nor for a god, but for man. And the idea being not just that a beast would be too savage or primitive to be fit for political life, but also that a god would foreclose the kind of space of meaning that politics involves, which is the contestation of individual human perspectives, their passions, their limitations as they're working themselves out, rather than some kind of godlike perspective that unifies it all. In the same way, during the Renaissance, Pico della Mirandola's Oration on the Dignity of Man gives a comparable defense of how the position of humanity actually has special dignity as a result of being situated above the beasts, but still below the gods. And Renaissance humanism in this picture is focused on not on becoming God, but on cultivating the distinctive strengths of individual humanity that may actually that are actually what allow us to contend and perhaps sometimes defeat the gods, as is sometimes the case in Trek. And I think in many ways that's the balance that is being worked out through this perfectionist vision of Star Trek. Han Noonien Singh represents an extreme case of perfectionism that ends up finding itself destructive and self-contradictory, almost destroys Earth and prevents this glorious future. But at the same time, we find that other godlike entities also sometimes lead dissatisfying lives. And I think this connects to a theme that I've been thinking about a lot lately with the rise of AI and Silicon Valley boosters talking about digital immortality or whatever else. And is that, and in particular, is an episode in Voyager where we encounter another member of Q who wants to die. He's tired of being an immortal. He's tired of having all this endless power. And the reason is that it makes his life totally meaningless. Nothing has substance or importance because, of course, he can have anything he wants one moment and then have whatever he wants the next moment. Nothing sticks. Nothing has weight. Nothing has depth. It's not really possible to think of long term goals because, really, what's long in comparison with eternity? And we get an image of this kind of dusty abandoned highway and a guy playing in the dirt like child's games. And on the one hand, there's these kind of reminiscence of the child Aeon and Heraclitus who's playing with dice, but on the other hand, there's this sense of like vast desolation and abandonment, like, oh god, this is all that life is for a Q. And I think this gets at one of the paradoxes. What happens when we become immortal? What happens when we turn ourselves into gods? Well, it may be that we actually end up undermining and distorting all of the distinctive powers, wills to power that human beings have. What makes us, what gives us the capabilities that make us unique, that lead us to create art and culture and lead flourishing lives, capacities that may be in excess of technological control and administration driven by dogmatic morality will stifle, but which, when taken too far, might ultimately lead in the aspiration to become God or immortal, might actually lead to a much worse outcome. And I think this is an interesting dilemma to think about it with Trek in relation to the present. I think when we're talking about present day fascism, um, I find it depressing to some extent to watch Star Trek these days, and it was weird to come at Star Trek at the moment that I did, because I think in many ways you associate it with a certain we have said we don't want to say utopian, but a certain optimism of the 1990s and the immediate post Cold War moment, this kind of optimistic end of history, where it was possible to imagine some kind of utopian future, but sometimes in a naive way. Star Trek gives us a much more mature and interesting version of this that isn't, as we've said, strictly utopian. But it does make me feel depressed that in the present we seem incapable of envisioning the future as anything other than apocalyptic. Or when people do envision it as aspirational, many of these are some of the worst people in the world who seem to want to like dominate and control all of us and become immortals themselves. Um, and it is, I wonder how we find something like how we again find something like that that aspirational sci-fi that is still morally mature uh, that Star Trek embodies, and I find it troubling that our ability to envision something like that is now submerged in just this prevalent, prevailing apocalypticism,
And
just this
I
sense
would
of prevention
say
at times.
that
Yeah,
that's one of my big problems with New Trek, as they call it.
yeah,
And I didn't watch much of it, but like the way Section 31 is handled is I think is a great example because Section
yeah,
31 in Deep Space Nine is presented as an evil.
yeah.
Section
Genocidal.
yeah, they are genocidal, but it's never spoken of as, you know, for a show that's often talked about as a show that as we have, that Cisco has to engage in those
Mm.
necessary evils from time to time. Section 31 is never presented as one of those necessary evils.
That's where the line is drawn in many ways. Yeah,
Right, that they're a subversive force that is extrajudicial. They have no legal sanction. They're willing to do all sorts of totally immoral things, and as you say, it mounts to the level of genocide. And then in New Trek, Section 31 is presented as like just sort of a branch of Starfleet that, oh, you never seen a black badge before? Those are the real hardcore guys. And it's almost like we're supposed to think that they're like badass or something. And I felt also that just the way the Federation is portrayed, especially in like the beginning of Picard season one, is so dysfunctional, and like they have like a version of Fox News almost, like with the way their
yeah.
journalism's being done and the callousness that's displayed by I kind of brought it up at the beginning. There's the trope of the badmirals, the bad admirals who are sort of have questionable morality, but nevertheless they're always presented as sort of like a bad apple or something, and again there's something to be overcome. And in Picard I felt it was almost sort of presented like this is just how it is,
Oh yeah,
you know,
yeah.
and it was very depressing and cynical. It wasn't apocalyptic, but it I did get that sense that, man, it is as if in the modern language of television or just conveying our stories, it's very hard to even conceive of a world like Star Trek or an organization like the Federation. You always have to have something that there's, again, like it's a veneer and there's a dark side, or you have to overemphasize the flaws to the point where it doesn't seem like it's a positive vision of the future. And I thought that was incredibly sad that it seemed
Oh, agreed.
like from the beginning of New Trek they were kind of trying to bring it down to this like gritty level that had been kind of corrupted by the Breaking Badification, the Game of
Yeah, they want to do
Thronesification of
Game of
everything.
Thrones, Star Trek Game of Thrones, right? Where somehow
Yeah,
all those moral norms are seen as we have a cynical, almost nihilistic attitude towards the kind of moral norms that Picard embodies because now we think they're somehow unrealistic. And
right.
in many ways, I also think this is kind of emblematic of the perfectionist problem that we are at risk of withdrawing our sense of withdrawing our morality from the world, from its applicability to the world, because the world is so corrupt and evil that we live in at present, and retreating then to the cynical perspective that ends up just kind of legitimizing and excusing from a very passive standpoint all these evils. And I do think like Picard season one, Picard season three is I found to be okay because it at least just kind of gave us, brought the next generation people back. But Picard season one jumps us into a future where we have a very vehemently human supremacist kind of culture that wants to, in many ways, almost violently destroy life, a artificial life that resembles the Borg. And while we recognize on the one hand that the understandable fear that Federation planets might have before the Borg now, the situation just is completely unrecognizable from the standpoint of how we think of the Federation and how
Well,
we imagine them handling that situation in the context of next generation. It's
and
just it's completely different territory.
can I say really quickly too, even at the beginning, I think it's in the sort of it's like the preface type the prologue sort of segment at the very beginning where they show it's where the supervisor comes in and he says, "Good morning, plastic people," and they have all of these sort of they kind of look like Data. They have the skin and the eyes, but they're
Hmm.
androids that are basically being used just for labor. And then they like rebel and shoot everybody, and then that's revealed to be some sort of plot. It was a very contrived storyline as well, which I did not enjoy. But it just struck me watching that. It's like, isn't this exactly what Picard is fighting against in Measure of a Man? Like
Yes, exactly.
he and Guinan have a conversation where he says we cannot let a ruling come down in which artificial life could be treated as a race of slaves. That is totally against our principles. And then Star Trek Picard just shows
Yeah,
even
we're thrown
before,
into it as in
yeah,
and just kind of asked to map that somehow onto our understanding of the Federation of the original series, The Next Generation, even Deep Space Nine, where again, as you say, Section 31 is pretty clearly where a line is drawn. Yes, there is indulgence in certain moral corruption, but as we discussed earlier, to some extent only because these characters are also capable of a super abundant goodness and self-sacrifice. But it is not cynical and is not nihilistic. And I guess to give the other side of New Trek in this respect, Strange New Worlds is, I think, probably the best of the New Trek shows, but I think it's the other side of the same coin, where they don't want to be gritty and dark. They do want to try to go back to the classic Star Trek themes, but it becomes a sort of cheesy meta commentary that almost has what's brilliant about the original Star Trek is that it has a naive faith in morality, yet nonetheless treats morality in a mature way from that standpoint and recognizes its trade-offs and the way it relates to power. And that's much of what we've been discussing. And Strange New Worlds, I think, is the flip side of the dark and violent. It is the indulging kind of what's fun about Star Trek to the point where it stops being morally serious. And I am skeptical that the new era of Star Trek will be able to find under its current corporate ownership anything like the spirit of the original in this respect, unfortunately.
yeah, it's the fate of becoming a brand, unfortunately, and I think it
A
is.
franchise era.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. And but I think a lot of it does have to do with the inability to envision positive futures or really any future. And
yeah.
yeah, it's a real shame. But I guess we could wrap it up here. We've been going for quite a while. I've had
Yeah, I
quite a
think
bit of fun.
it's a good I had a great time and I was really glad to be able to kind of air various thoughts about Trek that I haven't really been able to work through. And I think this conversation helped me actually reach a more interesting understanding of the show. So I really appreciate that. And I think, the theme we leave off with I think is an important one to keep in mind. What is the task of sci-fi as a project of speculatively envisioning future worlds that maybe we can realistically map to the present, but still really represent aspirations and goals rather than just this resignation to apocalypse. And
Right.
that's why Star Trek is important in my mind.
I 100% agree with that, and I think that was very well said. Devin, do you have any upcoming projects or anything you're working on that you want to give a shout out to the audience to keep an eye out for?
Yeah, so I know you are in the midst of teaching a Nietzsche course with the Acid Horizon
Wrapped
Research
up a week
Conference.
ago,
Wrapped
but
up. Okay,
or a
sorry,
couple
we
weeks ago.
just got
But
the
I
timing
had a
wrong.
great experience with that. I would
Great.
recommend to anyone who's interested in that. It is definitely worth it. I'm actually sitting in on Adam's class on Kant right now because
Awesome.
it's the seems to me a better alternative than reading Kant would be to listen to Adam talk about Kant.
And Adam is doing both the first and the second critiques, but not the third critique. Am I
Yes,
correct? Is
I
it
think
okay?
so. Yeah, I'm kind of just listening as we go. The first one was mostly about Hume and Kant's
Okay.
response to Hume,
Yeah, sure.
and but we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, but I guess then I would say I've talked with Craig about doing a course this summer, maybe June, July. And I don't want to give too many details yet because it's a little unsettled. We had talked about doing something maybe on the French Nietzsche revival, because that's really my wheelhouse. At the same time, I think it's pretty well covered. But something else we've been tossing around are some themes related to play in Nietzsche and culture and aesthetic creation as an emancipatory impulse in the history of seeing the play impulse and aesthetic creation as features of some kind of ideal of freedom that cuts against capitalist modernity. You see this in Marcuse, for example. So that's an idea that I'm playing around with. Regardless of how it ends up, I do plan to be doing a course this summer with Asset Horizon Research Commons. And I think they've really got a cool setup going on. I'm glad that your class went well. I hope this is kind of a foundation we can build on further. Otherwise, you may other people may know me for my podcast, Moral Minority. We have a recent episode on Lessing and the German Enlightenment with Jonathan B. Fine that just came out, and we will soon be doing, I believe, this coming Tuesday, an episode with David Bather Woods on Schopenhauer.
Awesome. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for joining me. And we'll sign off here. Or, I'm sorry, live long and prosper, everybody.
Yeah, live long and prosper. Thanks for having me, man.
If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.